Okay, thank you very much for all coming to the post-conference dinner governance panel, and I'm pleasantly surprised to see so many faces here. What I'm presenting today is part of an overarching project that was concerned with the mismatch of European nation states being very active in international policymaking arenas surrounding climate change and human mobilities, migration, but us not really knowing very much about the specific national contexts and political contexts in European nation states. And as François Germain said in the opening plenary, which I'm very pleased about, we need to start looking at people we don't necessarily agree with, right? Talking to them, finding out what they think. So I talked to a lot of people I didn't agree with as part of this project, and I'm excited to be able to start to present some of that. So as we heard, the project focuses on Austria, Germany, Denmark, and Sweden. A couple of logics behind this, one being that I wanted some neighbouring countries for interesting comparisons. I wanted some countries that had been on a migration route connected to each other in the kind of 2015-16 times of increased migration. But also it was very practical in that doing quite in hardcore discourse analysis, I needed to be able to read stuff. So it was also kind of based on language considerations. So the idea for this paper and actually using this method came out of document analysis, which showed that not really much parliamentary consideration of climate change and migration has been going on yet, with the exception of Germany, which I can talk about at length over the coffee break if anyone wants to know about those debates. There's lots of kind of governmental strategies, there's lots of civil society interactions, but I wanted to know more about parliaments because, you know, they're the legislature at the national level, right? They will have to ratify any agreements that come from the international level onto the domestic stage. And you know, it's an important picture to get because I think there we're also not just preaching to the choir. That's where we find these people that don't necessarily agree with us. They're still in these key positions. Yeah, so I wanted to know more about parliaments. And using a kind of critical lens, also, I just also wanted to be able to start looking at dominant structures, right? Not just in terms of passing legislation, but in terms of discourses and setting the tone for things going on. So that's why I was looking at these parliaments. And in terms of the I suppose normative positioning of my work, this is a quote from a very famous climate scientist in Germany, Schellenhuber. He made the argument that they should start making policies on climate and migration because even if it would just scare right-wing populists so they would enthusiastically support climate protection, we would have achieved something. And there was massive applause from lots of Green Party politicians. This is on YouTube, so this isn't anything that I'm not allowed to share. And this kind of really worries me because it's kind of playing on that like xenophobia of the right-wing populists and really reducing the debate to these two pillars. So that's something that I wanted to explore more and problematize in doing this research with parliamentarians. Very briefly, because I think people who really like Q were probably in the workshop yesterday about the Q method. I must admit, this is my first foray into using Q, and it was born out of necessity in that it was the pandemic and I couldn't go anywhere to talk to parliamentarians, and they wouldn't Zoom with me either because it was the pandemic and they were really busy. So I turned to this asynchronous tool that I could get them to fill out these Q method surveys for me. So it's a kind of mix of quant and qual methods that basically gives you a way to systematically analyse and examine human subjectivity. And if it's done well, it can give you kind of key viewpoints among a group of participants. So that's what I was using it for. And we did kind of two important components, one being statements that people organise according to this force distribution. So that's the one I used. So I had 50 statements they had to organise into that. And then we needed a group of participants. So my statements were drawn from at the time, the most recent election manifestos at the domestic level for each of the political parties that subsequently then made it into Parliament. This is really important because the statement should be kind of in a language close to what they would naturally use. It needs to be something they're familiar with and want to use. And they need to kind of see their positions reflected in the source. They have to have some they really agree disagree with. Okay. And then in terms of the participants, I again aimed for one participant from each political party. Didn't quite manage it, but I got 24 out of 30 parties to take place. I'm going to skip this. Basically, I found 4 key viewpoints. We can talk about the methods after if we like. I just want to actually talk about those viewpoints that I found. The first one I called a responsible position in the world. This really has kind of responsibility justice concept at its core. Positions to take the lead in addressing climate change, protecting people forced to flee their homes. And it's kind of vague normative idea of responsibility underlying it, as well as historical responsibility according to the UNFCCC kind of understanding of that. Social justice here also being key. This factor, they support international established norms like Paris and the right to claim asylum, and really it's unthinkable to get rid of those. One of my participants said, with the Paris Agreement, something historical was achieved. We need to achieve the goals and cooperate internationally in order to prevent a climate catastrophe. And again, these terms like catastrophe and crisis came through a lot in this factor, right? It's more focused on the kind of humanitarian impacts of forced migration than being interested in economic migrations particularly. And interestingly, their strongest negative views were in rejecting migration being viewed through kind of racist kind of xenophobic terms. The second factor is a little bit different. I've called it slightly provocatively climate reluctant racist. I might have to change that one in review, we'll see. They rank anti-migrant statements really, really highly. It kind of probably best represents a right-wing populist perspective. Emphasizes this kind of problematic discourse that I was talking about, right? This is who they're trying to appeal to with that discourse, I think. And they're kind of really interested in the dangers of uncontrolled migration, security system, social security, home countries, etc., job market, about immigrants having to conform to society's rules and values, etc. And just not that interested in climate change, but interestingly not actively skeptical about it. So they're actually grudgingly accepting of things like the Paris Agreement, which I find really interesting. It's got a much narrower perspective, understanding of responsibility, and more oriented towards the citizens within their borders, which I think is probably quite understandable. But I want to move on to factor 3 because I think this is a really interesting one, because in that polarized understanding of, we have the people wanting to fight the climate crisis, and then we have the populists, these perspectives are then not contained within that polarized understanding. So this is a factor that puts lots of trust in international institutions and norms, such as protection for asylum seekers, potentially binding European quota systems for refugees, Paris Agreement, etc., and critical of potentially abolishing such ideas. But at the same time, it's against kind of transferring responsibility to these areas. So working with the international community, placing trust in it, rather than necessarily individual nation states, which I found really, really interesting. And then I'll just briefly touch on number 4, because this I think could be quite confused with the second factor, so the kind of migration critical one I presented in number 2, because it's also a relatively protectionist worldview that puts the well-being of its country right at the centre. But it's not as skeptical of action either on human mobility issues or on climate change, rather wanting to define a way of acting that's based on the needs and opportunities for its own country. So it does some questionable things like having a restrictive view of asylum and migration policy, supporting the return of rejected asylum seekers, as well as people who fled wars once the wars are over. But at the same time, it's not quite as it's not critical of international cooperation as much as factor 2, in that it sees it as a possibility for levering the playing field. So in some ways, it's something that they could be supportive of if it's in their own national interests. So I think this is a really interesting, important nuance if we're trying to kind of access the whole political spectrum in talking about climate migration policy. So I've just summarised those four. I kind of argue in the not yet published paper that the contours of responsibility in terms of how dispatch is divided is what you need to be looking at. That's kind of a maybe more interesting way to kind of start looking at what different positions are. And we'll save any other details for questions.